Anyway, I couldn't resist and now the toolkit was in my hands. I hadn't realized that I was holding it tightly. He reacted with a slight flinch, but since he had the same excitement and desire, we continued. I took everything out with my own hands until the toolkit was empty. My mouth was watering, and I stuck it to my palate without wasting any time. The house was full, and as much as I wanted to, I didn't want to get caught. The toolkit was soaked as my mouth watered. Oh, hey. You've caught up with the best part of the story, so let me start over for you. It started on one of those evenings that feel like nothing out of the ordinary, when life is humming in its usual rhythm and you don't expect anything to disrupt it. I was curled up on the living room couch, scrolling aimlessly on my phone while my parents were in the kitchen, chatting over tea. The TV murmured some forgettable sitcom in the background, blending with the soft clinking of cups and spoons. I wasn't doing anything special, just another evening at home, where the hours slipped by unnoticed. I suppose I should tell you about myself first. My name is Mia, and I'm 26. If you ask my family, I'm already at that age where I should be married or at least heading that way. It's not that I'm against the idea, it just hasn't happened yet. Between my job, my friends, and my own hesitation about settling down, I've kept myself busy enough to push the topic aside whenever it comes up. My family doesn't really push, well, not too hard, but I can tell they're waiting for some miraculous moment when I'll suddenly announce I've met someone. That night, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was just glad to have a quiet evening after a long week. And then, the doorbell rang. I didn't pay much attention at first. People came and went all the time, neighbors dropping by, deliveries, things like that. But when I heard the familiar sound of excited greetings and the shuffle of multiple footsteps, I glanced up. My mom was already ushering them in, her voice lifting with that extra warmth she always saves for family. And then I saw him. Jack. My step-cousin. He and his parents had come by unexpectedly, and judging by the bags they carried, they were planning to stay the night. My dad's side of the family had always been close, though visits like this were sporadic and unplanned. His mom and my step-uncle went ahead into the kitchen, leaving Jack standing awkwardly near the doorway, brushing the cold off his coat. I hadn't seen him in years, at least not in person. Jack was only a couple of years older than me, but our lives had diverged so completely after childhood that I could count on one hand the times we'd actually met since we became adults. We were the kind of relatives who only really knew each other through filtered family photos and the occasional stories shared by our parents. He looked diffjacked now, in a way that startled me. Taller than I remembered, sharper in the lines of his face, his dark eyes carrying something quieter and more reserved than the boy I used to know. His presence caught me off guard, not just because it was unexpected, but because of how out of place it felt to see him here, in my ordinary little world. It wasn't a big moment. He gave a polite nod in my direction, the same way you'd acknowledge anyone you barely knew but were supposed to be friendly with. And yet, something shifted. I don't know if it was the weight of nostalgia, the strangeness of suddenly seeing someone who had been a distant blur in my memory, or something else entirely. But in that moment, I felt it, the beginning of something I couldn't name. I didn't know then that this visit would change everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't unusual for me to toss and turn when the house was full of guests, something about the slight shift in routine, the muffled sounds of others settling in, always left me restless. My room was small but familiar, with walls that I'd grown up staring at, yet it felt unusually stifling that evening. I'd already switched positions a dozen times, my pillow growing warm beneath my head, but no matter how I adjusted, I couldn't seem to settle. I finally gave up. Throwing off the blanket, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the cool floor biting against my bare feet. Maybe a glass of water would help, or even just moving around a little. Anything to shake off this feeling of restlessness that clung to me like a shadow. The house was quiet. Too quiet, except for the faint creaks of old wood settling under its own weight. I padded down the hallway, careful not to make a sound. The dim glow from the living room nightlight stretched faintly across the walls, casting elongated shapes that seemed alive in the stillness. And that's when I saw it, his door, slightly ajar. I hesitated. It wasn't deliberate, not at first. I just happened to glance that way as I passed, but something made me pause. The faint light from the window inside illuminated part of the room, and in that sliver of space, I could see him. Jack was standing by the window, his silhouette outlined against the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. His posture was tense, his hands tucked into the pockets of his sweatshirt. He didn't look like someone who'd been woken up, no, it seemed like he'd been standing there for a while, lost in thought. I don't know why I stayed. I should have moved on, quietly made my way to the kitchen or back to my room, but instead, I lingered, my bare feet rooted to the hallway floor. It wasn't as if he was doing anything unusual, just looking out the window. And yet, something about the scene felt charged, as if I'd stumbled upon a private moment I wasn't meant to witness. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears. There was something in his stillness that drew me in. A quiet intensity one couldn't quite name. His shoulders rose and fell with a slow, steady rhythm, and though his face was turned away, I could almost sense the weight of whatever thoughts were pulling him so far from the present. Before I realized it, I'd shifted closer. Not enough to cross the threshold into the room, but just enough that I could see more, the way his hand occasionally flexed in his pocket, the subtle tilt of his head as if he was searching for something in the distance. I didn't call out to him. I didn't make my presence known. Part of me was afraid to, as if doing so would shatter whatever fragile moment this was. But I couldn't look away. I don't know how long I stood there, seconds, minutes? Time felt suspended, stretched thin by the silence between us. And then, as if sensing my gaze, he shifted. His head turned slightly, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, our eyes met through the gap in the door. It wasn't a full look, more of a flicker, a fleeting moment where our gazes collided before he glanced away. But in that brief connection, I felt something sharp and unspoken pass between us. An awareness. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, the way his shoulders tensed as I moved, or if he'd noticed me at all. And yet, I felt exposed, as if I'd crossed a line simply by being there. I turned and hurried back to my room, my breath unsteady, the moment replaying over and over in my mind. I didn't know what it meant, or why it unsettled me so deeply, but as I lay back in bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep felt even farther away than before. I wasn't expecting the knock. I'd only just pulled the blanket over myself, trying to slow my racing thoughts, when I heard it, soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. It wasn't loud enough to wake anyone else, just enough to catch my attention. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, instinctively clutching the blanket closer. And then, the door creaked open. He didn't wait for an invitation, maybe he thought I wouldn't give one. Jack stepped inside, the light from the hallway framing his figure before he quietly closed the door behind him. The air in the room shifted instantly, heavier now, as if the space itself was holding its breath. "I saw you," he said, his voice low. I stared at him, my chest tight, my heart thudding like a drumbeat I couldn't control. He didn't say it accusingly, nor did he seem angry. If anything, he looked uncertain. Like he wasn't sure why he was here any more than I was. "I didn't mean to," I blurted, though the words felt clumsy, inadequate. My voice was barely a whisper, caught somewhere between an apology and an excuse. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his movements careful, deliberate, as if afraid to disturb the fragile tension hanging between us. I could feel the warmth of his presence before he even reached me, and when he stopped just beside the bed, my pulse quickened. "You were watching me," he said, quieter now, his gaze steady. I couldn't deny it. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, unable to look away from him. His eyes, dark and steady, held something I couldn't quite name, a question, perhaps, or maybe an answer I wasn't ready to hear. The faint glow from the hallway cast soft shadows over his features, sharpening the edges of his jaw, catching the curve of his mouth. I couldn't sleep, I admitted finally, the words trembling as they left me. His lips twitched, almost a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Neither could I. And then, without warning, he reached for me. Not roughly, but with a kind of quiet urgency that made my breath hitch. His hand brushed mine, warm and steady, before wrapping around my wrist, grounding me in the moment. His touch was firm yet careful, as though he wasn't sure if I'd pull away. I didn't. Instead, I felt myself leaning forward, drawn to the heat radiating from him, the weight of his presence so close to mine. He crouched slightly, bringing himself to my level, his hand still resting lightly against my wrist. His other hand hovered near my shoulder, hesitating for the briefest moment before settling there. The room felt impossibly small now, the air thick with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. His thumb moved in a slow, unconscious arc against my skin, a tiny motion that sent ripples of awareness through me. I could feel the roughness of his palm, the faint calluses brushing against the softness of my arm. I looked up at him, and for the first time I saw it, the flicker of vulnerability behind the confidence he tried so hard to wear. His breathing was steady, but his chest rose and fell just slightly faster than before, betraying his composure. "Mia," he murmured, my name soft on his lips, as if testing its weight. It wasn't just the sound of my name, it was the way he said it, low and careful, like it meant something more than just two syllables strung together. His hand shifted, sliding down to my elbow, his fingers curling gently around it, anchoring me in place. "I didn't mean to startle you," he added, his voice barely above a whisper now. I couldn't not come. I couldn't speak. My thoughts were tangled, my senses overwhelmed by the closeness of him. The faint scent of his cologne lingered in the air between us, warm and earthy, mingling with the sharper edge of night air that had followed him in. His presence filled the room, seeping into the quiet spaces between words, between breaths. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence stretched, not awkward but heavy, thick with unspoken things. His grip on my arm tightened ever so slightly, not enough to hurt but enough to hold me still, to let me know I wasn't imagining the way his touch lingered. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let myself stay there, caught in the warmth of his hands, the steady pull of his presence. My own hands hovered awkwardly near my lap, unsure where to go, what to do, until finally, instinctively, I reached up. My fingers brushed against his sleeve, hesitant at first, before curling into the fabric. My hands slid under the sweatshirt. My hands were now on his skin. I could feel the curve of his abdominal muscles. This sent a huge shiver through me. I could guess that he was feeling the same way because the bulge in his toolkit was getting bigger and bigger. I knew it was wrong, but he was my step-cousin after all. Right? Besides, I hadn't experienced anything for a long time. Anyway, I couldn't resist and now the toolkit was in my hands. I hadn't realized that I was holding it tightly. He reacted with a slight flinch, but since he had the same excitement and desire, we continued. I took everything out with my own hands until the toolkit was empty. My mouth was watering, and I stuck it to my palate without wasting any time. The house was full, and as much as I wanted to, I didn't want to get caught. The toolkit was soaked as my mouth watered. He was holding the back of my hair affectionately with one hand, but he overdid it a little later and left me breathless. I looked up and smiled breathlessly. I reached out and the toolkit started moving around the installation. I couldn't resist and I begged in a low voice. He didn't hold back and let it enter the installation. The energy waves were turning into sounds from our mouths with each contact. He covered my mouth so as not to attract attention, but then a low voice came from him. "I'm ready," he said. I straightened up immediately and prepared my face for him. There was a warmth in my whole body, but the warmth on my face was something else. It was everywhere on my face. I smiled, I was happy, we were happy. At that moment, some crackling sounds were heard from outside. We got together immediately and he went to his room with fast but sure steps. That night was the most unforgettable day in my 26 years of life. I'm sure it was the same for him.